that I said at the very end was that there wasn't a lot that was known about the Jews between the dedication of the Second Temple, 515, and roughly 440. One of the things that is clear during that period of time is the fact that the questions remain. Where is the king? Where is God? Fundamental question, even though the exile has ended. We do know that during and after the exile, one of the things that happened within the Jewish community was an incredible amount of creative energy. We talked briefly about this last week when we talked about Genesis 1 and the P source, the P document. But the creative energy went beyond just the P document. Towards the end of the exile and into the post-exilic years, Jews did a final editing of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. The Deuteronomistic works, things like 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, came into written form. Many of the prophets that we talked about way back, okay, were now put into written form so that their words could be heard over and over and over again. And this is the time in the post-exilic world when new works came into being, works by people like Ezra, Nehemiah, and the 2 books of Chronicles. These new books of literature reflected the concern of these returnees much more directly than did older literature. Okay? What I mean by that is oftentimes older literature was reverentially edited to take into account what they had experienced. The priests and the scribes of the exiled community shaped a lot of what we consider to be the biblical worldview. One example of that is the role of Jerusalem in the Bible. The importance of Jerusalem is decisively shaped by their experience of loss and destruction, by their experience of exile. Jerusalem would rise to become a central religious, political symbol of Judaism. Now, it's not that Jerusalem wasn't important before the exile, but its destruction and their removal from it made it even more important. There were also changes that would be seen with the pre-exilic Israel and Judah versus the post-exilic Jewish culture. Bear in mind that prior to the exile, Judah had a monarchy. They had major institutions which included the Davidic kings, the dynasty with the claim to divine investiture, which we heard several weeks ago in 2 Samuel 7, and which you will hear again on the 4th Sunday of Advent, where the Lord, through Nathan, said, "For when you die and are buried with your ancestors, I will raise up one of your descendants, your own offspring, and I will make his kingdom strong. He is the one who will build a house, temple, for my name, and I will secure his royal throne forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son." And then another institution of the pre-exile Judah was, of course, the Solomonic Temple. However, we have to bear in mind that with the exception of the short-lived reforms of Hezekiah and Josiah, that temple housed many cults in the pre-exilic Judah. And then another institution was, of course, the prophets. And as we talked about, the prophets were in service to the kings, and they were equally critical of the kings. They also were the major advocates for worshiping Yahweh alone. Now, we're going to say more about that in a moment. In the post-exilic world, okay, Judah politically was rebuilt as a Persian satrapy. And a satrapy is merely a province, the Persian word for it. It was a semi-autonomous province under the control of the Persian Empire. In the case of Judah, this semi-autonomous province would be ruled by the priestly elite who had returned from Babylon. Bear in mind what I said a minute ago. These priests, whose views and attitudes had been shaped by all of that creative, energetic work while they were in Babylonia. This group of returning priests would be at odds with the local population. Think back, we said that there was a remnant left in Judah and in Jerusalem. So the returnees would be at odds with them. That is because these priests who were returning began to rigorously enforce separation from the mixed multitudes that inhabited Judah. They also strongly emphasized rule on the basis of the Torah. This meant that post-exile, Judah had become much more of a theocratic state, meaning ruled by priests rather than kings. One of the things that the priests would do would be to emphasize the keeping of the Sabbath as a strictly enforced day of rest every seventh day. And that requirement had no parallel in any other ancient culture. Now, in post-exilic Judah, the Persian influences were noticeable. They would come into Jewish apocalyptic literature, where you would find symbolisms of good versus evil, of angelology, which we talked about briefly last week when we were talking about Zechariah, and the figure of Satan, which we mentioned briefly last week. More importantly, though, Persian influences would be seen in the fact that the language of Judah would now be Aramaic. People always ask, why did Jesus speak Aramaic? Well, it goes back to this period of time, post 515 BC, the Persian influence. And there would be a new institution that would arise at this time, and that would be Levites as auxiliary priests. Way back, somebody asked, what about these Levite priests? Well, this is where they emerge, is post-exile. How do we know it's a post-exile reality? Well, if you read the two books of Chronicles, in both of them, you will see an emphasis on the importance of Levite priests. And that is virtually absent from the earlier works, such as the two books of Samuel and the two books of Kings. Yes?
Now, you said that Jesus spoke Aramaic. Did they have any, or did he have exposure to like another language, Hebrew, or he just said that's what he read? I don't even know how much he read, but.
Well, two things. We're coming to the other world language at the time of Jesus. and that was Greek. Greek at the time of Jesus was the dominant world language, especially of the upper classes. In Judah, among Jews, Aramaic had become the working language of the people.
And that was Persian, basically.
And that came out of the Persian control.
Yeah.
Okay? And that would be the everyday language of the Jews from roughly, let's say, 500, 450 BC, all the way through the time of Jesus. But at the time of Jesus, and you'll see why in a moment, Greek had also.
So what was the Torah written in?
Hebrew. And that's what's significant. Up until now, the language had been Hebrew. And now, because of this exile and this return, the language that they were using was now Aramaic. So this is when that becomes part of the reality. The other things for us to bear in mind at this period of time, roughly 500 to 400 BC, Judaism it may have felt like a cult in the old days, but it is now a religion with a sacred center in Jerusalem. Now, when I say cult, please don't think about Jonestown, whatever the name of that place was in Guyana and stuff like that. When I say cult, I mean something that is experienced within a small group of people, somewhat isolated from everything else. Jerusalem is now the sacred center for those who would claim themselves to be Jews. And that would be true not only for the folks in Judah, but for the diaspora. And it is at this time that we begin to see a focus on elaborate pilgrimages to the temple in Jerusalem. All those psalms that, some Bibles still do this, some don't, but, in the old days, the psalm would say, a psalm in procession, a psalm of lament, a psalm sung at the altar, and descriptive comments like that. That's all coming out of this post-exilic time, when people would come from the diaspora to Jerusalem. It also meant that the temple would become the recipient of lavish gifts and taxes from the diaspora. Now, in the old days, Judaism, and this word is on your handout, Judaism practiced what was called monolatrism. It's a big, fancy Greek word. The first half, mono, comes from the word monos, which means single. And the second word in Greek is latreia, which means worship. All monolatrism means is that as a group, the Israelites recognized the existence of many gods, but they only worshipped one God. Okay? Single worship, one God. All of this because of the command in the commandments which says to worship God alone. Okay? That's what they were doing. Post-exile, Judaism has become monotheistic. And that's also on your handout. Mono meaning single, theos meaning God. One God. Absolutely one God. There is a belief now in one personal and transcendent God. Now, we heard echoes of this when we were looking at Isaiah 2 weeks ago or so. He wrote in chapter 45 of the book of Isaiah, this is what the Lord says, I will go before you, Cyrus, and level mountains. I will smash down gates of bronze and cut through bars of iron. I'll give you treasures. I will do this so you may know that I am the Lord, the God of Israel, the one who calls you by name. And why have I called you for this work? It is for the sake of Jacob, my servant, Israel, my chosen. I am the Lord. There is no other God. So even pre-exile, 2nd Isaiah was making this point. It's now written down for every by the post-exilic time, it's written down for everybody to hear. Now, at the same time that these returnees had come to Jerusalem, there was also a portion of the diaspora which was in Egypt, probably dating to the destruction of the temple in 586. And they practiced their own version of Yahwehism and built their own temple on an isle in the Nile. So the Babylonian diaspora and the diaspora from the northern kingdom were not the only places where people were living out their worship of Yahweh. This Egyptian community is important because during the time of the Second Temple, especially back here 500 to 400, okay, they were on friendly terms with the Levite priests in Jerusalem, despite the fact that in Egypt they had a syncretistic worship. That's also on your handout. It simply means I'm pulling in a little bit of everything from everybody, regardless of whether, frankly, it makes sense or not. They gradually abandoned their syncretistic worship as they became more comfortable with the Levite priests. But they are important for yet another reason, and that is what little we know about the history of Second Temple Judaism at this point in time. It comes from some worldly sources, but believe it or not, it also comes from documents which were found at the temple that was the center of the Egyptian diaspora. And those documents were found when they were excavating for the Aswan Dam in the 1960s. So their presence in Egypt has given us some information about a time period where, especially for Judaism, there isn't a lot of Jewish history that they can wrap their hands around. Into the middle of all this come Nehemiah and Ezra. Nehemiah was a cupbearer to Artaxerxes, the king of Persia. And he came onto the scene around 445, 444 BC. He tells us this in his book because he says that I was a cupbearer to Artaxerxes in the 20th year of his reign, and we know from history that Artaxerxes I came to the throne in 465. So easy enough to figure out. Nehemiah, in exile still in Babylonia, learned of the remnant in Judah and that they were in distress, that the walls of Jerusalem had been broken down, and he asked the king's permission to return and rebuild the city. Artaxerxes sent him to Judah as the governor of the province with a mission to rebuild, with letters explaining the king's support of the rebuilding, and with timber from the king's forest to be able to accomplish this. Now, Nehemiah was a very devout man. He obeyed the law strictly. He had a complete fidelity to the Torah, to the Sabbath, to the Hebrew language, and to no intermarriage. And so he gets to Jerusalem, and what does he find? None of the above. He also, because of his strict adherence, was resisted by the Jews who had remained in Jerusalem. In addition, he was resisted by the Samaritans, who were led by a man named Sanballat I, by the Ammonites, by the Syrians, by Arabs, and by Philistines. So he comes in as the governor, and nobody, absolutely nobody in the territory likes him. What they opposed, in particular, was Nehemiah's desire to reassert Judah as a politically autonomous commonwealth. These are the people that had stayed. They had all figured out some way to survive. And now here comes somebody who wants to buck up Judah as an autonomous institution. Well, Nehemiah basically thumbed his nose at the opposition, and he managed to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem in 52 days. He took measures to repopulate the city and to purify the Jewish community by canceling debt, promulgating the law of Moses, and enforcing the divorce of Jewish men from their non-Jewish wives. You can just begin to imagine how popular that made him. He did serve 12 years as the governor, upon the end of which he returned to an area in the Persian Empire that was east of the Tigris River. But shortly after leaving Jerusalem, he found out that folks had fallen back on their old ways. So an altar to Zeus had been placed in the temple. Non-Jews were permitted to conduct business inside Jerusalem on the Sabbath and to keep rooms in the temple. Nehemiah once again was furious and returned to Jerusalem, purified the temple and the priests and the Levites, and reestablished enforcement of Mosaic law. He was aided in all this by Ezra. And I forgot to say, you want to know more about all this, just read the books of Nehemiah and Ezra. They'll tell you the whole detail. In 428, roughly 428, Ezra returned to Jerusalem from the Babylonian exile. And we're not, historically, we can't necessarily verify this, but First Esdras, which is a book of the Apocrypha, tells us that he was the high priest. Ezra came to Jerusalem to enforce the Torah. One of the interesting things about the book of Ezra is that there are portions of it, roughly 3 chapters, that are written in Aramaic, in the original scrolls, the rest of it being in Hebrew. So this Persian influence of Aramaic language, again, is present. Ezra would publicly read from the law of Moses, from the Deuteronomic code. Remember back when Josiah was king, he discovered this scroll in the old temple, and it included parts of what we now call the book of Deuteronomy. He would read that regularly. He would assemble the Israelites in Jerusalem. Could these be the pilgrimages? Possibly. But he would assemble the Israelites and the Jews and call them to enter into covenant to keep the law of Moses and to separate themselves from other people. In other words, to become pure Jews again. In the middle of all this comes a prophet that we have to spend a moment or two talking about. He's the last prophet of the Persian era, and that's Malachi. Again, his exact dates are unclear. And unlike Micah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel and others who gave us biographical information in their works, Malachi gives us few biographical and historical details in his book. One of the best clues, though, that he gives us is that in chapter 1, verse 8 of the book of Malachi, he uses a Persian term for the governor of the area. So we know that he absolutely not only has to be post-exile, but post-Second Temple and post the Persian conquest. He also, in his writing in chapter 3, makes clear that the temple has been rebuilt. Now, chapter 3 is going to sound familiar because I want you to imagine a basso profundo standing up in a church with Handel's Messiah in the background, and he's going to sing these words. Malachi wrote, "Look, I am sending my messenger, and he will prepare a way before me. The Lord you seek will suddenly come into his temple. The messenger of the covenant, whom you look for so eagerly, is surely coming, says the Lord of heaven's armies. But who will be able to abide it when he comes? Who will be able to stand and face him when he appears? For he will be like a blazing fire that refines metal, or like strong soap that bleaches clothes. He will sit like a refiner of silver and burn away the dross. He will purify the Levites." Hint, that means he wrote this after the Levitical priesthood had become a reality. "Refining them like gold and silver, so that they may once again offer acceptable sacrifices to the Lord. Then once more the Lord will accept offerings brought to him by people of Judah and Jerusalem, as he did in the past. I am the Lord, and I do not change. That is why you descendants of Jacob are not already destroyed. Ever since the days of your ancestors, you have scorned my decrees and failed to obey them. Now return to me, and I will return to you. But you ask, how can we return when we haven't gone away? Should people cheat God? Yet you have cheated me. But you ask, what do you mean? When did we ever cheat you? You have cheated me of tithes and offerings due to me. You are under the curse, for your whole nation has been cheating me. Bring all the tithes into the storehouse so that there will be enough food in my temple. If you do, says the Lord of heaven's armies, I will open windows of heaven for you. I will pour out a blessing so great that you won't have enough room to take it in. Try it. Put me to the test." In the book of Malachi, he describes social conditions that are unquestionably of this period in the 400s. He mentions abuses of the tithes, of the taking care of the widows and the orphans. All of these correspond to the kinds of scenarios that Nehemiah found when he returned the second time to Jerusalem. And all of this allows us to suggest that Malachi was probably at work and writing around 435 to 430. Then we have a gap. Not a lot known. However, it's not as if nothing is happening. It is about 100 years later, 336 BC, that a man named Philip, the king of Egei, was murdered. You say to me, what is Egei? Doesn't matter. He was succeeded by his son, Alexander. In 334, Alexander, with 30,000 troops, would march east. He would march through the areas of what in the time of Jesus would be called Asia Minor, through towns and places that appear in the book of Revelation: Lydia, Ionia, Pamphylia. He would march through there, all of which is modern-day Turkey, on his way east. He would meet Darius III, king of Persia, in 333 BC. And he would defeat him. He would continue his march east, as your map suggests. Just follow the arrow where it says India. But he would then circle around and come back. He would come back and he would take Damascus and Sidon. There would be a siege of the town of Tyre that would last for 7 months. Remember I mentioned earlier that the Samaritan leader was named Sanballat? Well, remember the Samaritans were principally in what was the old northern kingdom, which is of course near where Damascus, Sidon, and Tyre are. Sanballat was no dummy. So he was the governor, the Samaritan governor, appointed by Darius. He renounced Darius and joined Alexander's side. He asked Alexander to let him build a sanctuary on Mount Gerizim. He knew that if he could build a sanctuary in the north, it would divide this budding Jewish nation and weaken them. However, that would not come to pass, because Alexander would lay on a siege at Gaza, and Sanballat would die in the siege of Gaza. Say that 5 times fast, okay? Just a reminder also that Gaza and its troubles today have an ancient history as a battleground. So, Alex besieges Gaza for 2 months and conquers it. He has now got the northern kingdom and he comes into the southern kingdom. The march through Palestine would be unopposed, except for that time at Gaza, but he solved that by just raising Gaza to the ground. Interestingly enough, all of this is mentioned in the first book of the Maccabees. And after Thanksgiving, we are going to be moving into talking about the Maccabees. Now, the first, what are there? 3 books of Maccabees?
There's first and second Maccabees.
No, it's 4 Esdras. It's 2 Maccabees. That's right. Okay. The book of the Maccabees will become, and the work of the Maccabees will become very important post-Alexander. But they do indicate in that first chapter Alexander's presence in Palestine. There is also, this is from First Maccabees. They wrote, this history begins when Alexander the Great, son of Philip of Macedonia, marched from Macedonia and attacked Darius. Alexander enlarged his Greek empire by defeating Darius and seizing his throne. He fought many battles, captured fortified cities, and put kings of the region to death. As he advanced to the ends of the earth, he plundered many nations. And when he had conquered the world, he became proud and arrogant. By building up a strong army, he dominated whole nations and their rulers and forced everyone to pay him taxes. The Maccabees went on to say, when Alexander had been emperor for 12 years, he fell ill and realized that he was about to die. He called together his generals, noblemen who had been brought up with him since early childhood, and divided his empire, giving a part to each of them. After his death, His generals took control, and each had himself crowned king of his territory. The descendants of these kings ruled for many generations and brought a great misery on the world. There's no bias on the part of the Maccabees, but you'll see why after Thanksgiving. Daniel, whose book, parts of it are believed to have been written around 250, makes reference to Alexander as a mighty king who will rule a great dominion, whose kingdom shall be destroyed after his death. Alexander would end Persian rule in what used to be Judah, and he would usher in a Hellenization of the Middle East. The Jews would continue to speak Aramaic and practice their religion as they had under the Persian Empire. This was because Alexander believed that all races were equal, and he wanted unity of mankind. And all of that would be a challenge to Judaism. His vision would lead to cultural and political conflicts throughout the Hellenistic period. And of course, ultimately to a war of defiance against the Roman Empire, during which Judah, Jerusalem, and the Temple would be destroyed for a second time. But that's light years beyond where we are right now. In 1906, a group of rabbis produced in New York a volume of books which was called the Jewish Encyclopedia. And the funny thing is, footnote, the publisher of the Jewish Encyclopedia in 1906 was Funk and Wagnalls. Does anybody remember who made fun of Funk and Wagnalls?
Dictionaries.
Dictionaries.
Right. But remember how Johnny Carson always said that Karnak was reaching into a Funk and Wagnalls dictionary? Well, all I'm leading up to is when I saw who published this, I thought he was being facetious, and I thought that the dictionary, because all I had ever seen was Webster's, lo and behold, I'm discovering it really existed. They published the Jewish Encyclopedia. In it, the rabbis and the scribes who wrote for it said, Alexander gave the high priest his hand when he arrived in Jerusalem and went into the temple and offered sacrifice to God according to the high priest's direction. The following day, Alexander asked the people what favors he should grant them. And at the high priest's request, accorded them the right to live in full enjoyment of the laws of their forefathers. He furthermore exempted them from payment of tribute in the 7th year of release. To the Jews of Babylon and Media, he also granted the same privileges, meaning those who had not returned to the land of Judah. To Jews who were willing to enlist in his army as he went all over the known world at that time, he promised the right to live in accordance with their ancestral laws. Afterward, the Samaritans, having learned of the favors granted to the Jews by Alexander, asked for similar privileges, but Alexander declined their request. Alexandra married a daughter of the Persian king, and at the same time, he made 80 of his chief officers marry daughters of high-ranking Persians. Now, he already had married another Persian princess, And so he had now adopted this Asiatic custom of polygamy, which the Greeks had never accepted prior to that. His two wives became bitter rivals, and their antagonism did much to cause the downfall of Alexander's empire, especially after his death. Alexander would finish his conquest from Judah because he would go west to Egypt and would conquer the Egyptian people almost without contest. And so thus began an interesting and a complex cultural relationship in the ancient world. The Greeks basically had never really come across anybody like the Jews, and vice versa. Initially, things seemed very positive. The Jews found in the Greeks a deep intellectual tradition, a tradition that was borne out by the work of such people, contemporaries as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Contemporaries meaning not that they all lived at the same time, but that within the last 100 or so years, those three names whom we know well today had all been very active within the Greek Empire. In fact, Aristotle had been one of Alexander's tutors. To the Greeks, the Jews were intriguing. These were monotheistic people. Think about that for a Greek. They had this interesting God who was loving, infinite, creative, and who acted in history. Not during the time of Alexander, but 100 years later, one of the benefits, shall we say, loosely speaking, of the Hellenization of this area would be the emergence of the Septuagint, which is also on your handout. The Septuagint is the Greek, no, let me say this a different way. Septuagint is the Greek word that means 70. 70 rabbis were compelled to translate the Bible from Hebrew to Greek. They were put, in essence, in a room. They were sent off to a corner of Jerusalem where their job was to produce a Greek Bible. And I don't remember, and I failed to look it up, how many days, but I think they had no more than 70 days to translate the existing Hebrew Bible into Greek. They accomplished it, and for the first time, the Jewish scripture was now in a language other than Hebrew, which of course made it accessible to a lot of people who weren't Jewish. But we get slightly ahead of ourselves. 2 weeks from today, no class next week. 2 weeks from today, when we come back, and we've got 3 classes to get us to 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. But we will kill off Alexander, and then we're going to move into the intrigue that is represented by the Maccabees and the advent of Rome in the Middle East, and how all of that begins to play against a lot of the things that we have been talking about as the Jews get more comfortable in their post-exilic world, but some of the same questions are still there. Where is God? Where is our King? Questions?
Actually, I want to point something out. That I'm not going to preach about this, but I want to draw your attention to it. If you were at the 8 o'clock service, just think about Ezekiel, the Old Testament lesson. those of you who are coming to the next service, pay attention to Ezekiel, because the image of the shepherd that he paints is an image of a king in a world where the rural economy, in a rural economy where one of the number one professions was taking care of livestock and sheep. The image of a shepherd became a metaphor, if you will, for a king. And here's the interesting thing. You've got to pretend that you don't know anything about Jesus, okay? That he just hasn't come. And Ezekiel paints this picture where God himself will come. I will be the shepherd of my sheep. I myself. What could that possibly mean? What could that possibly look like? What were the only other images of God's presence in the midst of his people? What were the only other images that they have? Think way back. You've got the Exodus. How is God present to them by day?
Pillar of cloud.
Pillar of cloud. And he was present by night.
A pillar of fire.
A pillar of fire. He was present in the tent of meeting, in the tabernacle.
Big cloud of smoke.
Right. They had these images, these various images of what it might look like if God himself would come back and be king. There are other images, though, that seem to suggest that coinciding with the coming of God himself to be king would be a David figure, a messianic figure. And most of those images don't seem to be at all in contradiction to the coming of God, but no one ever pieced together that the David figure and the coming of God image were the same. No one ever put that together. So as we read this passage in Ezekiel, it's almost like we're getting ready for Advent early. That we're waiting now for the coming of God. God is going to come in some way. And this is the hope that began with the return from exile. The hope that got disappointed with the creation of the second temple. That was a big disappointment. And I think in large part because their return from exile didn't look like the Exodus. All the promises that God's going to show up and God's going to be king, well, the only images they had were pillars of cloud and pillars of fire and all these other things, and none of that happened. And yet they never lost sight of this hope that God himself was going to show up and God himself was going to be king. So pay attention to that. And then when Jesus in the gospel says that he's telling a parable, by the way, but he's clearly telling a parable that will hearken back to Ezekiel, among other images of God as shepherd. And I think is subversively telling a story about himself as the shepherd and the king. And people still aren't getting it. Anyway, that's the excitement. That's the exciting thing that just builds up as we move into 000000. Is these strange prophecies of God himself is going to come, and so is this David figure. But what could that possibly mean?
Have a good Thanksgiving. See you all in 2 weeks.